Us. Happy Sunday. My name is Robert. We're going to get started in just a few seconds. We're just wrapping up some technical items and we'll get started shortly. Thanks so much for being here. And special thanks to my friend Ed for hosting us.
Robert?
Hold on just 1 second, Ed, and we'll turn things over to you.
A question.
Oh, sure.
Some folks are raising their hands already.
Oh, yeah. For everyone that's joining us, if you're raising your hand, it's better to just type any questions or comments you have in the Zoom chat or the Q&A. We can't, we have too many people like to call on. And plus we haven't gotten started yet, so. But anyway, thanks for joining us. Hold on for a minute. Okay, let's go ahead and get underway. Oh, wait, Ed, hold on. Let me take the screen back from you because I have to walk through what we're going to be doing.
All right, and actually my thing disappeared. Oops.
Okay, hi everyone, welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is Robert. Let's go ahead and get started. This is Slavery and the U.S. Economy live stream history program. And for those of you that didn't do so already, we always welcome people to introduce themselves in the Zoom chat or the Q&A. So you can let us know your first name, where you're connecting from, and what are you looking forward to this summer? So my name is Robert. I live back and forth between Austin, Texas and Washington, D.C. currently. Presently in Austin, Texas, but looking forward to coming back to Washington, D.C. in the next few weeks. And what I'm looking forward to this summer is traveling and visiting museums and seeing people in person. What about yourselves? You can let us know in the Zoom chat or the Q&A or in the comment section if you're following us on Facebook Live. And we don't do a Zoom demonstration in these programs, but just real quick, for anyone that might need assistance, there's usually only a couple things that people have questions on. Number one is the sound. So everyone will be in listen only mode or muted, except for myself and Ed. If you do want to raise or lower the volume on your session, you can check the settings locally on your own device. We did a sound test earlier and everything seems to be working fine. If you want to adjust the screen display so that the slides that we're showing take up the full screen, and if that's not currently happening because there's boxes with my name and Ed's name on them, you can minimize those by clicking on view or view options, which is usually at the top of a person's device, and you can check off the side-by-side mode. About our program, if you have any questions or comments, please let us know, and Ed and I will be happy to answer those. We'll answer the comments, though, at the end of the program. Oftentimes people ask questions that are answered later on, so we'll do that at the end. And we're Washington, D.C. History and Culture. We're a nonprofit community organization. Our mission is to bring people together to experience history and culture. And I'll be not really your host, just the person to get things started. My name is Robert Kellerman. I'm the founder and the director of the Washington, D.C. History and Culture organization. We're currently just recently celebrated our 6-year anniversary. So thanks to all of you who've participated in our programs, either in person in Washington, D.C., the first 5 years we've been in existence, or online for the past year. We're gonna, if you're in Washington, D.C., either living in the Metro Washington, D.C. area or gonna be visiting at some point in time in the future, we're actually going to be starting up our in-person programs tentatively in the month of July. So I don't have all the exact details for that, but if you're listening in Washington, D.C., you can be on the lookout for that. That's a picture of me in the center of the photo leading a tour of the Holocaust Museum. And even when we start our in-person programs, we'll continue doing these live stream programs just because we've gotten such great positive feedback from all of you. So thank you very much. And I'll be introducing my friend, Professor Ed, in just 1 second. Before I do, I wanted to mention this is part 4 of a series that he's done for us. Part 1 was called Enslaved Washington, D.C., 1790 to 2021. Part 2 was called Empire of Blood. That was Europe from 1554 to 1807. And then part 3 was Slaver Nation from 1495 to the Jim Crow era. Now, if you didn't get a chance to see any or all of those programs, don't worry, because they're on our YouTube page. So you can find us on YouTube. The name of our channel is Washington, D.C. History and Culture. I'll post the links for that in the chat in just a few minutes, so you get an opportunity to listen to that. But with that, let me introduce my good friend, Ed. I hope he likes this. This is my favorite picture of Ed with his dog and a big smile on his face. So with that, I will turn things over to Ed. And Ed, it's all yours. Take it away. Oh, and just as a reminder, this program runs for 2 hours. So if you need to take a break, just, I guess, do so yourself. And if you happen to miss something or have to jump off early, don't worry, we're recording the program and you can always listen to it again later. So with that, Ed, take it away. It's all yours. And thanks so much, Ed, for taking time out of your busy schedule to present to us.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, folks. I'm going to get this thing started.
There is a promise of a storm. If you want change in your life, walk into it. If you get on the other side, you will be different. And if you want change in your life and you're avoiding the trouble, you forget it. So Harriet would say, wade on in the water, it's gonna really be good water. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. My God's gonna trouble the water. Oh, see those people, how they dressed in white. He gonna trouble the water. You know they look like the children of the Israelites. Yeah, he gonna trouble water. Come on and wait. Come on, wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. My God's gonna trouble the water. Well, see those children resting lives gonna trouble. Well. Well, you know they come a long way and they ain't turning back. No. Oh, I feel like I gotta wait. I got to wait in the water. Wait in the water, children. Wait in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. You'll see the children dressed in woolly. God's gonna trouble the water. It looks like my people dip alone.
Everyone, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. It's a hard work we do in terms of the education we're all about. I respect everyone here who is taking part in that particular education. I'm honored that you would give me a part of your time. Any errors are mine, and any goodwill that is developed is from the folks who take the time to be here. 156 years ago on this date, 19th of June, military persons in Texas announced to the enslaved persons there that they were no longer enslaved. This is the celebration that we know as Juneteenth. As we probably may or may not know, there were two actually Emancipation Proclamations. One was for DC alone, the year before Lincoln did his one for the military. But so June 19th is a third date that gets mixed into here. And the point of everything that we're talking about here, I'm going to just start right into it. Slaves for sale and breeding, credit available. This is an advertisement in Louisiana in 1857, exactly what we're talking about. And so you would normally see this particular subject called the domestic slave trade. I don't like that particular language because I think it avoids and confuses what we're talking about, which is a post-colonial US economy built on Black lives. The first question, of course, is post-colonial. What do I mean by that? I mean that the whole point of the argument in 1619 makes this was that that whatever happened at the Constitutional Convention, that the US was supposed to see a decline in enslavement. What in fact we see is an 80% increase. So what we're talking about here today is something that occurred in what we now call the United States, not colonials, not Britain, not Portugal, not Spain. A post-colonial US economy built on Black lives. Two quotes to start. Southern traders ended up making human property the most valuable form of capital investment in the South. And I'm going to amend that throughout this and by saying in the North as well, because the point of today's presentation is to consider how the entire United States, North and South, profiteered and profited and took economy and cash from the bodies of enslaved Black persons, male, female, and children. The bodies of Black men, women, and children enslaved in America were assigned monetary values throughout their lives. They were mortgaged, as we will see. They had credit available for them. Some background. Congress outlaws the international buying and selling of enslaved Africans and other chattel in 1808. This was part of the compromise of the Constitution. The South wanted a 20-year delay on this. And while there is much said about it, this was an economic move, not humanitarian. But notwithstanding, as we'll see today, the enslaved population in the US tripled over the next 50 years between then and the Civil War. And during these years saw the forced removal of over 1 million people by extortion, threat, and violence. All states, Southern and Northern, participated in a, quote, diaspora, and it's a word I do not like because again, it's like the term Holocaust. It sanctifies and renders benevolent something that is in fact an atrocity, something that is in fact removes the agency from the person who actually did the genocide and did the removal and did the violence, the slave traders and those who profited from them. And this greatly surpassed in volume the European brutal genocide of African indigenous peoples. I use the expression indigenous to refer to persons native to an area, whether they are what we would call Indians, which is not really appropriate, and or Africans, which isn't actually appropriate either because there are over 3,000 nationalities and nations in what we would call Africa, and each one of these peoples has a specific rendering that they prefer. But the interstate is what we're talking about, north, south, south, north, buying and selling of Black and indigenous American, the Indians, continued well into the 1860s, and in some places beyond the Civil War. It removed by force approximately 1.2 million men, women, and children from home and family. The vast majority of these after 1800 were born in the United States. I'm going to repeat that. The vast majority of these persons were born in the United States. And by 1850, most US enslaved were third, fourth, or fifth generation Americans. These persons, bound and domesticated like farm animals using the same chains and collars and whips, were stateless. They were a colonized people. So what we're going to do today, the next hour and a half, perhaps, maybe a little bit more, what history teaches. We'll talk a little bit about the Federal City, the slave market of America. Well, some of this you may be familiar with from other presentations that I've done. This traffic in humans, that's a quote, body speculation, selling persons south, financed by the north. The word stock market in New York and where that comes from may surprise some folks. How the enslaved patterns in the United States were greatly expanded by Western expansion and Indian removal in New Orleans. Black lives at market, probably what we most hear now, the civic ritual of the white auction, how auctions in public places established the first privilege of being white, and they did this as a communal ritual. Virginia's peculiar economy, carry me back. Virginia and Maryland and Washington, D.C. bear a burden of being the center of so much of the energy around enslavement. Virginia could no longer make tobacco or cotton because they had actually ruined the land. And so the greatest crop, I'm sorry to say it that way, was in fact Black bodies. And we're going to look at North Mason-Dixon, people that we really talk about. What happened in New England? Why was it easier in New England to be an abolitionist? Well, because there was no room for the enslaved in terms of the way that they had been deployed in the South. And we'll talk a little bit about New England's what I would call whitewashed history and culturally approved narrative, what I usually call museum talk. Massachusetts, the indigenous, the Indians and the Puritans. New York, Duke of York, the Slaver King, Slaver Town. Some facts here may surprise folks. Follow the money, bodies under mortgage. Did we know that Thomas Jefferson had most of his enslaved persons out for mortgage, like we would now mortgage a house? Philanthropy, how to launder money in plain sight if you're an institution like a bank, like Chase or Morgan Price, or a university like Georgetown, my own, or Johns Hopkins, Harvard, UNC, doesn't matter. And so we start, axiomatic, things that we just take for granted. When we don't wish to take responsibility for violence, we use language. And the language here that I'll be referring to are the terms and the laws and negations. We're talking about ministry and how we're taking care of these people and their family, which masks what in fact is actually happening and the dominance. And before the Nazis could render Jews and others stateless, I use that word again, thinking about Black Americans. The Nazis first had to move them outside of the law and dehumanize them. And it's the patterns by which we dehumanize that we'll be talking about. Actions and words and protocols and practice. The most effective weapon of empire, finally, is convincing the colonized, the stateless, the justice of the colonizers' narrative of them. Women who are listening to me know this as well as I do, that in a man's world, to hear the man's way of speaking about a certain specific gender topic, that's the narrative that we take in. If you are a queer or any other person who is in some way aslant of particular gendered norms, how many years have you carried around in your head the appropriate or the right way to be? Because this is the narrative that we receive. So at the back of what I'm doing here is listening to the cultural narratives that we are given and that we take part in, and the language in our head that we ourselves use. And the first thing that comes to mind is, well, but some of my best friends are, etc. We know this. We have been in places ourselves where the language has had its effect. And so we're going to launch right in. First, to clear the air of the usual rhetoric and narrative, the divide between the colonies and post-colonial US. This document speaks for itself. July 4th, 1776, the same date that its author died in 1826, July 4th. We hold these rights to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He borrows here from Locke, and he erases Locke's expression, pursuit of property, turned pursuit of happiness. And one wonders, was Jefferson here talking about the 14-year-old enslaved half-sister of his wife that he was, how do you say, having relations with? Possibly. It certainly was not an agency-full relationship. Between Sally Hemings and Mr. Jefferson, they had 5 children who were enslaved. Jefferson never freed them, or he actually acknowledged in print anywhere that these children were his. Were these rights self-evident for these persons? No, actually, because what this line refers to is the first one. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary that a people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what this is in defense of. This is in defense of, it is time for this people to dissolve their bonds to England. It has nothing to do with human rights as we would understand it. So, we wonder, how do we get this place? And one hears so much about this as a Southern problem, and it ended in a civil war. The photos here are Delaware photos, and they are into the first, this one here is in the 1920s. Okay, whipping post, corporal punishment, which was a holdover from the enslavement days. But I want to begin by first acknowledging the first colonized people. I'm going to read here a small quote about the map of John Smith. Quote, it's in red. His masterpiece map of Virginia, published in 1612, remained in active use for 7 decades and opened this part of North America to European exploration, settlement, and trade. This is how we scrub a history. We think we know this story, but do we? What is not mentioned, let's say the life and the land theft and the persons and Pocahontas, whom we think we know from Disneyland perhaps. We do not know that she was enslaved by John Smith's people when she was 12. She was then, I'll say, carted off, kidnapped to Britain, renamed Rachel, and presented to royalty as some kind of animal. So we don't know that particular story so much. We don't know that, even though the New York Times says that enslavement in Virginia started in 1619. It's actually no. Enslavement in Virginia with the indigene, the Native Americans, as we call them, started as early as 1526 and 1495 with Columbus. So there's a whole 125 years of enslavement that needs to be taken into account. So I acknowledge that this first colonization. What history teaches us, the rationale for the federal city's location. And the federal city, we know, perhaps, is Washington, D.C. There's an advert that we'll see that they call it the slave market of America. And one gets to ask, how does the capital city of a institution that, in theory, seems to be based on human rights, permits the buying and selling of property, persons, in the United States, in its capital. And it provides the reason, taxation without representation, still. So Washington chooses the exact site along the Potomac and Anacostia rivers for the new federal city. There's a whole background, and we went through this before, and if you are interested in looking at it, the capital was first in New York and then in Philadelphia, and it kept being moved south. It was in Philadelphia, and the North needed money to pay the Revolutionary bills. The North didn't have it. The South offered to pay for it. And if you know Hamilton, this is what the Hamilton was about. The South offered to pick up the war reparation that if they would move the state capital, federal capital, closer to the South. So what you're going to see here, this is Maryland and this is Virginia. This is the odd square shape, and you're going to see eventually that part of Washington goes away. So the thing also to keep in mind here, and very seriously, is that, I'm going to go back here just for a second, Why is it important here? Jefferson and Washington both have plantations right here. This is Georgetown. Alexandria and Georgetown were enslaved transport capital harbors from the mid 1700s. This is very important to understand, that this is the reason the South wanted the federal district right here. Let's have a little bit of chat since we're talking about George Washington. This on the left is a runaway slave enslaved from George Washington. This is another advertisement for Washington's runaway slave. And this is George Washington's establishment with, in 1852, with an enslaved person sitting in front of it right at the very beginning of photography. Most of the people that we know and revere held, bought, sold, and bred enslaved persons. And my usage here is I don't try to use the word slaves, I will use the word enslaved persons. It's like calling homeless, just talking about the homeless. We forget the fact that there are persons attached to these terms. So for the first 72 years of its existence, Washington, D.C., this is the capital behind it, highlighted America's most difficult truth and its contradiction, enslavement. Its placement along the Potomac between enslaved states of Maryland and Virginia ensured that slavery was ingrained and its power visible in every aspect of life, buildings and institutions and social fabric of Washington, D.C. For that reason, it still lacks representation, and this manifests its original race dynamic. The slave market of America, this was a broadside that for years characterized Washington, D.C. And in the first row, you see the Declaration of Independence on the one side, you see the Capitol, and you see the map of the various places in D.C. And I go through this in Enslaved Washington if you haven't seen it. And to this day, you can't walk down the street of Washington, D.C. anywhere without seeing a visible evidence, bricks from a specific building, places where persons were killed or kidnapped. The second row contains 3 images of prison in Washington who were built to detain unsold slaves and runaways. The final shows, again, you have Virginia and Alexandria Harbor, and you have the very famous Neal and Co. slaves being loaded onto a ship. This traffic in humans. So back to the point, international transport and plunder of lives could be ended by Jefferson in 1808 without economic difficulty, because within 25 years of the Revolution's end, the domestic buying and selling of enslaved Black Americans replaced the laws. And this is where you see the term international slave trade and the domestic slave trade. I try not to use those particular expressions because they obfuscate and they hide the actual agency of persons who were doing this. And the domestic here simply means North and South men, traders usually, mostly men, are buying and selling captive, held, enslaved Black men, women, and children. One sale that we'll see here later has 30 children who were not even counted. There were 30 infants 3 years old and under who were not even counted as part of the sale. But in general, this was, quote, exporting enslaved women and children and men south from Maryland and Virginia. They went north too, but Maryland and Virginia were the repositories, again, with Georgetown and Alexandria, but specifically being the places. This was a major economic activity in the US until the 1860s. Not even cotton came close. And there's all of this is factual, and there's a wonderful bibliography on all this material. It's astonishing the information we do not know about this. Historians estimate that 600,000 captive African persons were transported directly to the US out of the 12 million data bank for the international slave trade. The 11.5 million enslaved usually went to the Caribbean. Some of them then were taken into the States and mostly South America and Brazil. But 500,000 were transported directly to the US through Charlottesville, which we will see later. And the buying and selling within the states far surpasses this figure. Between 1830 and 1840 alone, nearly 250,000 enslaved Black Americans were taken across state lines. These are enslaved, domesticated persons who are stateless. They have no legal recourse. They are property. And this is made clear in the 1857 Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court. In the 1850s alone, mere years before the Civil War, more than 193,000 persons were transported, most of these coming through Washington and Maryland and Virginia. Historians estimate that nearly 1 million in total were brutalized, chained, and forced in markets of antebellum US. The 1860 census showed 4 million enslaved persons. There were something like 70,000 in 1790. So you have an 80% increase since the ratification of the Constitution. The question again remains, is the Constitution, we keep hearing the rhetoric about, we hold these rights to be self-evident, understand that that's not what this was referring to. But the Constitution is fairly coy. They hide themselves. They never once talk about enslavement. It sounds like Downton Abbey, people held to service, people who are doing work as service, people who are in a service capacity. They never mention the word enslavement. So the reason for the estimate for the 80% increase, westward expansion, including Jefferson again with the buying without any authorization, the Louisiana Purchase. We think nothing of this particular issue, but we don't hear the reason why that particular property was purchased. Relocating the quote civilized tribes, and that was kind of the government's expression of the civilized tribes of Georgia. The Cherokee, for example, who held slaves and tried to be just like their white owners. Profits from forced breeding of enslaved, and this is where it gets difficult, and the cotton was an afterthought. 1832 quote, Virginia exported, quote, upwards of 6,000 slaves per year, a source of wealth to Virginia. Another writer gives the figure in 1836 as 40,000 enslaved, a profit of $24 million per year. So while the crops of cotton and tobacco, while they had ruined the land for that, they had moved away to a different crop entirely. And where demand for the enslaved was strongest, the southwest of the country, Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana, later Texas and Arkansas and Missouri and California too. Here there was abundant land suitable for plantation agriculture. Unfortunately, in Georgia and South Carolina and Texas, the land had people on it. It was somebody else's. In one place it was Mexican. So the Mexican-American War in 1846, there's a reason we had that war, and it was for the expansion of enslavement. This was the expansion of the white moneyed population. Roderick Dhu again writes that Virginia is a Negro raising state, quote, and that Virginia produces slaves. A book that can be read on it. So what, just really quickly here, and these kinds of data you can find in any particular point, but I want to look at these two particular maps. This is the slave population in the Upper South. This is the enslaved population in the Lower South. The arrows are where the persons are being shipped, moved, usually a walking chain side by side. And you'll notice that from 1790 through 1860, there's no sense of diminishment at all. In fact, it's just steady, 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 steady. They're not being brought in internationally. The point here being is that they are being bred and sold. So most of them are coming from the South, from the North, this way through here, Baltimore, Alexandria, and Richmond in this particular area right in here. And then it all moves out, that's the particular way. In the 1850s, 10 years between the Civil War, 250,000 people alone were sold. All of these persons were born and died in the United States. They did so stateless. They were colonized persons without rights, without terms. They were property. They were citizens in every way except legal case and social usage. Race prejudice became legal. Photography in about 1850s lets us see, should we want to see, what we're talking about. These are our people, half of them American. Interesting to look here, for example, we got a cargo of, so property, you have language about property. In Aaron or Ape, you have the whole rhetoric of, you see this in a lot of the kind of the white supremacist kind of Christianity, and I'm speaking now as a Christian myself, so I'm not trying to throw shade on Christians. But the language of polygenesis, that in somewhere along the line that there's a, that yes, Genesis has the original creation of a male and female, but that these are, of course, were white people, and that all these other people somehow came in other different kinds of places. So the theory behind enslavement was polygenesis, that there were many genesis, and that Aaron or Ape shies away a little bit from the fact that there's some kind of crossbreeding between animals, four-footed animals and two-footed animals. And so that Black persons, African persons have a specific reference to an animality that white people do not have. And again, this is kind of the theory and the rhetoric in the 17th and the 18th century that even Jefferson preached, and we can talk about that. But the odd thing is that as much as they are a cargo, they are also humanly named. And so there's this the disparate back and forth between property and 39 men, 15 boys, 24 women, and 16 girls. Western expansion, we'll talk a little bit about this. We're going to talk about the economics of empire, Western man and enslavement. We're going to talk a little bit about the Louisiana Purchase, 1803, and you're going to think about the 1794 Haitian Revolution, in which the enslaved basically reclaimed the land and began to make it their own. And France's kind of haste in the early 1800s to eliminate the whole area that we would call the Louisiana Purchase. And Jefferson's equal haste to purchase the property without any kind of congressional record, without any kind of congressional approval. And partly because as a Virginia landowner, which was his primary responsibility at the time, he understood that he was in fact taking profit from his enslaved, from breeding his enslaved. He says that, he writes it, it's in his diaries. And the point of Virginia plantations owner is they are exporting their enslaved not only down what we call deep south, but to the west. The Lewis and Clark expedition, again funded by Jefferson, which was actually Sacagawea. We know who Sacagawea is. We're never told that she was in fact an enslaved indigene who was forced to do these things. We know a little bit about the Indian Removal Act, and you can go to Andrew Jackson's statue in front of the White House, built actually by enslaved persons who violated every treaty that we had with the indigenous nations, because they discovered that the land in Georgia and South Carolina would be perfect not only for cotton but for rice, and so that the indigene had to be removed, irrespective of what the treaty said. So when I talk about we want to do violence, we use words. This is the kind of language that I'm talking about. The paper words by which the United States protected itself, or at least covered its actions. The Tishana Republic in 1836, and how the U.S. essentially moved enslavement a whole quarter of the nation over by assuming basically what came down to almost a third of Mexico, complete with the Mexican population already there. And then California, whose constitution was an anti-slavery constitution to begin with. I mean, who was for permitting enslavement of the Native Americans. So the good U.S. nation relied heavily on New Orleans to receive new goods. And so we just talked a little about this. Jefferson's always conscious of his primary plantation owner. He's here. He's understanding that the enslaved persons are moving this way, the Western market. And at the back of this, understand the Haitian and the Caribbean, and it's an eye-opening history to have some more notion and understanding of the Caribbean, which generally tends to be passed over, except as it is a base for British colonization. And one wonders why, say, the United Kingdom gets away with so little reference about enslavement when they started it. It's because most of their enslavement was done up through the dominion countries. So a study of the Caribbean in its own agency is important here. Westward, the course of enslavement. There you see Sacagawea, the Lewis and Clark expedition, 1803 to 1806. Jefferson did not waste any time before sending people out. His hope was to get these particular persons held captive, and they succeeded by Mexican authorities that would give them some sense of how well the Mexicans were holding on to this particular land. California, on the right you see an enslaved person in California in 1848 with the discovery of gold. The arrival of the Spanish colonists into California introduced chattel slavery through the Franciscan missions. Again, the language of missions and taking care of people, and it's our mission to be these persons' spiritual guide, that Christianity and the cross and gold are inextricably linked in all this. And you can say, well, but that was 100 years ago or 500 years ago, and you can't really blame the Christians for doing this, or you can't blame Catholic churches, or you can't blame. It is with church-worn Protestant as well as Catholic that enslavement happened, and it was with church apologies and rhetoric that did this. Junipero Serra and the Franciscans, for example, brutally exploited the indigene, and Serra is up for beatification right now, and the indigene in California are rightly up in arms about this, to use that particular expression. If you go into any of the missions, of the Franciscan missions, you'll see in the center of the courtyard a place for public punishment. So to the point of where most of us will probably be more familiar with these, what the next section over here, and what has preceded is largely history, and I'm sorry that I have to go through it particularly so quickly. I can certainly recommend, and I think I've given Robert a bibliography of things that can be read, but if we don't know the history of the American indigene and their enslavement, North and South, if we don't know the history of the Spanish missionaries, both starting in the Caribbean and Columbus, if we don't know the particular history of Jefferson and Louisiana Purchase, and if we don't know this particular history of people like Nathan Bedford and the Confederate narrative, we need to know that, and because otherwise we're simply continuing a whitewash by which, while this was not our history and we had nothing to do with it, we still profit from it. So we're talking here about Black lives as product, and I was very particular at the words product, or Black lives as matter, as material, as commerce, auctions and places and persons, and none of these is easy to view. And we're going to start here with what I call confirming whiteness, that local sales of enslaved reaffirmed a community's public commitment to the economics of enslavement. The next event I'm going to be doing for Robert will be looking more specifically at resistance, the resistance narrative. And it's hard to talk about agency and Black colonized persons because they had none. They had no specific either legal recourse, or in many particular cases were given any kind of access. And so the kind of language that we use tends to be kind of the Gothic or the Western narrative or the rise of the heroic man. It's very different than that. And it's hard, as a white historian trying to talk about these matters, I eventually end up putting it back into the European context that I was educated in. You know, Gothic narratives and Western narratives and the heroic narratives of just, you know, you can see where I'm going with this is, how do we get this outside of a European context and allow individual voices to speak? How do we get Harriet Tubman to have her own particular discourse? But a local sale of enslaved persons dedicated a public commitment to the economics of enslavement. And the point here is that you will see numerous people, including Thomas Jefferson, who will decry the viciousness of slave traders. Uncle Tom's Cabin, for example, probably the book, as Lincoln said, that caused the Civil War, She is very particular about pointing out the badness of the slave trader and the goodness of, quote, the normal enslaved person who simply had to sell their slaves because they didn't have any money. Well, this is the reason that Jefferson did not, quote, free his enslaved. 200 at his death were sold to basically to pay for the maintenance of Monticello. And people ask me, oh, so do you go visit Monticello? And I say, I do not. A side note, and all of this history now, I end up now getting on my computer through Google, all kinds of references, go visit Monticello. So the tourism doesn't stop. So this picture is 1850 in Easton. Okay, not far. If you lived in Virginia or DC, if you go to the beach, if you go to Salisbury, you pass right through these places. So the important part here was not only the sale and the transaction, but the event itself, the ritual moment of selling in Kentucky, 1848. Kentucky is kind of Wild Western. This is where it was with Jefferson. But Maryland is a very civilized place. It still is. I mean, and the point is that so we go back that it was not respecting where the sale was, that didn't have anything to do with whether it was on the frontier or whether it was in the smack of Connecticut or New York, as we will see. And both of these, as you see, these are not sparsely attended events. You see everybody from children, you see women, you see men. Of course, the British made much of this, and so this is an artist named Crowe who went up and down the South and basically publicized this for Britain. This was an image out of Baltimore, and a younger person is being held enslaved, and probably a mother. Here you go back into Charlottesville. Again, these very early renderings of photographs that you have are Charleston. We'll talk a little bit more about Charleston, but and here you can see it's not the cotton as much as it was the sugar or sugar in the Caribbean, and here the rice. Often one will hear a Black activist talk about the colonist crops, why these people do not wear cotton or do not wear or do not smoke tobacco, because these are the colonizers' crops, and that this is a form of resistance that probably we could all practice in different kinds of ways. So many of the images that you're going to be seeing going forward over here this is an 1835 Charleston slave market that would generally be put like not a tattoo, but a piercing onto the enslaved body. New Orleans. The New Orleans slave economy became especially lucrative between 1820s and 1860s. Again, just to pause, this is not that long ago. Created by Isaac Franklin in 1818, Franklin & Co. Armfield. You can drive down the street in Alexandria and you can see it right on Duke Street still. One of the most famous interstate slave trading companies. And when Franklin retired, he was the wealthiest man in the South. We'll see this more in the narrative as we go on here a little bit later. The formidable money market behind this, that the northern and international investment, mortgaging, credit, and sales for what was emerging to be a market of persons rather than cotton. It's interesting for your time it's looking at the detail of some of the particular of the paintings, and we'll see here. Here, again, I want us to notice on this, from this day of sale, payable annually, secured by bonds and mortgage of property sold. Straight up front, we don't ever hear about this particular part. But in the same way that we would now apply for a mortgage or loan on a car or a house, that language, that what they call the dead hand mortgage, what we get that language here from, the first persons that was done was in fact on human beings. Field hands, you see the same thing. Unlimited credit. So it's like a 4th of July sale where you're gonna buy a mattress and get a kind of credit. $7,500 for Hannah and her 2 children. 1864 to the very, very, very end. Valuable gang of young Negroes, Wednesday the 25th, men and women field hands. New Orleans again. Purchase terms, 1/3 cash and the remainder at 12 months credit for approved city paper bearing vendors' lien, mortgage of slaves, and eventual interest of 8%. That's the terms here. There's an irony here. You can go to the Woodrow Wilson Bridge in Washington, D.C., and one is never told that he's one of the most infamous white supremacists that the West East knows. Whether you go up and down 95 and go to the Woodrow Wilson road stop there, it doesn't tell you that he's a white supremacist. It doesn't tell you that he segregated Washington, D.C. Makes none of those points. It doesn't say that he's featured in Griffith's, what's the film? I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name of the film, where he talks about it's the white race.
Birth of a Nation.
Birth of a Nation. Thank you. I'm getting ahead of myself over here. Thank you, Robert. But one doesn't. It's not told that he's in Birth of a Nation with the quote that says, "When the white nation found that it had to take things into its own hands, it does." But the point of this particular narrative, you go to the end of the Washington Monument, end of the Woodrow Wilson Bridge on the Virginia side, and you look at the early pictures. The bridge ends exactly in an unmarked graveyard of Virginian slaves. Not a word is mentioned about that. Okay, how many millions of men and women and children are buried in our lands unmarked? And I do more of that in the Georgetown and DC in that presentation. But the reason we have so many names and dates of particular slaves is because the record books of how much they were worth were very particular. So that if we want to recreate a public history of enslavement, we don't go to churchyards and we don't go to where you would under a normal Christian or a Jewish synagogue or into the Middle Ages. If you want to do a track of a nation of persons, you go to the church registry. Not here. Here you go to the land registries. Nathan Forrest. Again, a larger narrative over here. If you had to go through the South and count how many commemorative devices one sees for this person or that person or Confederate this or Confederate that, the Equal Justice Initiative talks about that there were 4,000 lynchings between 1885 and 1914, I think is their term. And they were beginning a campaign to install monuments for each of one of those at least markers. And the point is you're true. It's like Washington, D.C. You just look at the names of the streets of Washington, D.C. Look at the names of the buildings. The mayor right now has a project called DC Faces, in which they have identified 26 to 45 DC parks and names and titles whose names simply do not represent the population. General Servant of Negroes, and this is hit the Negro Mart. This is Forrest's primary business. Forrest and Naples slave dealers. This is the man who became the first general of the Ku Klux Klan. And the point here is, again, doesn't mention he made his career as a businessman. Does not mention enslavement. This is the sale I talked about. This is very late in the end, just before the war between the states, Civil War. 460 Negroes, over $3 million worth of property money transhand over here. This was the one, quote, where they threw in the 30 babies who were under 30. Installments to be secured by mortgage on the sale and approval of personal security or approved, accepted on city papers. St. Louis. St. Louis was notorious because it allowed this behavior to basically walk up and down the center street. So you could, in the same way that you could have a kiosk selling glasses or things on, say in the airports here. Now you would have kiosks here, any particular place you wanted, a little stands where persons would be featured for sale. What remained of the pens was demolished in 1963 to make way for Bush Stadium. There's a larger conversation here in the same way that half of Anacostia in DC was removed to make for Nats and the rehabilitation of that particular area. So what happens when sports comes in very often is that the persons who live there are removed elsewhere. And that's not what this is about, but that is certainly an issue that can be addressed. Lynch's slave pen, again, interesting name for him, but his office on Locust Street becomes this. And one of the worst involved, the open sales of enslaved Blacks at various places along the city's busiest streets, an accepted community response. Washington, D.C. For those of you who are not from Washington, the White House, Lafayette Park, Black Lives Matter. This is where the president went out and took over here to the church this particular summer after the murder of George Floyd. What's interesting about this particular space here, and when you can see over here an old image of the capital of Washington, D.C., with the enslaved market, you see the mother and you see the child. Mothers and children are a genre in the United States, and you can see them in American literature, that whenever we need to make a moral point about persons, we use mothers and children. And so you'll talk about unwed mothers, and you'll talk about children, and so every day CNN or People Magazine is going to have something about how some parent, usually a mother, is doing damage, usually killing her children. And one wonders, what about the fathers in all this? They're not involved in any of this particular point. What is the point that we keep making about mothers and children? To the point, Lafayette Park is an astonishing archaeological dig. The statue here of Andrew Jackson in the center, built by enslaved persons, Andrew Jackson, who viciously pursued the indigeneity out of the West. He was known as the Indian killer because he first made his history on basically the frontier between what was then still the United States and the land that had not been claimed, but or the land that had been given to the Native Americans. And this particular land was a slave market, was for a while a cemetery, was an auction block, but all of this within eyesight of the White House. So the mayor's Black Lives Matter is telling an important thing here. We know this, the Hirshhorn, right across the street, the most notorious enslaved slave pen in Washington, D.C. 12 Years a Slave was the story of a man, a free man from Boston who was basically held captive, picked up off the street in Washington and held here and then shipped south. You even hear Abraham Lincoln talking about colonizing and taking the repatriating Africans, quote, Africans home. And the point is, let me make it again, is that by Abraham Lincoln's time, none of these folks came from Africa, they were Americans. But the point of sending free Black Americans out of the country would make it easier. This is not a humanitarian gesture. To eliminate the free Blacks is to consolidate the whole on the Blacks who were property. Philanthropy, how to launder money in public. This is the Smithsonian. This is Georgetown University. And I will say, we'll talk a bit more about Georgetown. Georgetown has been very good. And one of its, in 1838, one of its Jesuit presidents, Father Maletti, against church desire and church permission, essentially sold off 272 enslaved persons in order to keep the school open. Patrick Healy, it turns out, was 1/8 Black, and so they celebrate him as, as Georgetown's first Black president. the problem here is I negotiated in class with say people like Obama, who is, by his words, technically a mixed race, as this man is. Sally Hemings, she was 3/4 European. So one scratches one's head, you know, this one drop of blood, this quantum of measurement of blood that actually we take from the Jews in the Renaissance in medieval Spain is still functioning with us now, and we use the terms politically indifferent. The Smithsonian has a different take on it because the Smithsonian has much of George Washington enslaved background and history to it. All right, moving along, carrying me back, Virginia and the flush trade, and it's a question about this tune, Carry Me Back, and the nostalgia element. Virginia's entire economy was based on the institution of chattel slavery. All right, it's 12 noon, straight up. Let's take a couple minutes break. People can go off and get a coffee, take a pause. Robert, are we okay? Can we do that?
Oh yeah, of course, Ed, whatever you want to do. That sounds excellent. So how many minutes do we want to meet back here in?
Let's say 5.
5 minutes? Okay, everyone, we'll see you back here in 5 minutes. Thanks, Ed.
Robert, whenever you're ready.
Okay, it's all up to you. So let's go ahead and get back started. Thanks, Ed.
All right, folks, again, thank you very much for being with me in what's really a very difficult topic. And I have to short lots of different things but there's larger narratives and some very good work on all of this. And we hear the language of white supremacy.
Ed, just 1 second. Let me interrupt you. Sorry. I just wanted to let people know I put in the Zoom chat and the comments on Facebook the bibliography that Ed was talking about before that had a lot of additional sources of information if you want to learn more about the topic. So that's in the chat in Zoom and the comments in Facebook Live. Sorry about that, Ed. Thanks very much.
Very, very thankful for all the help that I can get. We hear the term that we hear these white supremacy, and we think that this is something that's just brand new and just happened in the last 4 years. I want to go back here and think about the first bill of nationality and immigration, 1790s. The Continental Congress and the Constitution. The Constitution has just simply been ratified 2 months earlier. The first Immigration Act says all free white persons of good morals are qualified for immigration. That's what the law is, and that law stood until 1952 with those particular words. The interesting point there is free white persons. Not only was white the requirement, but you had to be a free white person. What? I thought all white people were free. Well, as a matter of fact, because of the language of enslavement and servant and how it was used, there was never they were making up apartheid one law at a time, as we will see. Cromwell sent over any number of Irish prisoners of war from the British wars in Ireland, and they essentially were enslaved. And that's a different story. And there's the story of John Punch, who's related to President Obama, and the 2 Europeans who escaped. But so that as we talk about it here, I'm going to come out here to 1874. Now, this is again 10 years after the ending, 9 years after the ending of the war between the states of the war. This is the Journal of the House of Delegates, State of Virginia. And I think I probably should pause here and say some of my best friends are Virginian, because I'd spend a lot of time talking about the primary area and kind of the schizophrenia sometimes of what happened in Virginia law and where it started and where it leaves us now. This quote: "Henceforth let it be understood that the political equality of the races is settled and the social equality of the races is a settled impossibility." The point of apartheid, the point of the legal restriction of the Jim Crow laws was such that it was to undo what they would call the Civil War Amendments 13 and 14 and 15. And so by 1874, Virginia sees that they have already done this. The political and social equality of the races is a settled impossibility. Let it be understood that any organized attempt on the part of the weaker and relatively diminishing race to dominate the domestic governments is the wildest chimera of political insanity. Okay, it's hard to read these sorts of things, but when people start to say, well, no, but it's just segregation, it's apartheid. And later on in this particular series, I'm going to do a session called Legal, which is simply reading the laws that set this up. And by now, the export market from Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, well established by the 1780s. As early as the Constitutional Convention, Pinckney of South Carolina explained that, quote, "Virginia will gain by stopping importation from Africa. Her slaves will rise in value and she has more than she wants." South Carolina and Georgia whites called out for slaves. And in fact, what we call our policing apparatus started in 1704 in South Carolina as vigilante slave patrols. But newspaper advertisements of 1787 show already that Virginia was ready to supply them. Just received from Virginia and Middle Tennessee, 1857. Notice how late that this material is still happening. Quote, "Just received from Virginia and Middle Tennessee a likely lot of young Negroes, likely, I don't know if there's spirited would be the word that we would use now, or engaging, or so we would use the word differently. A likely lot of young Negroes consisting of field hands, house servants, and #1 cook and general house servant." Virginia, Maryland had little agricultural development. In fact, they had ruined their lands. So their need for enslaved were mostly for replacements for decedents. The increased domestic production of enslaved Black African Americans replaced kidnapped African indigenes. Here's Jefferson, quote, "I have observed that our families of Negroes," it's interesting. On the one hand, they're families, they have names, they're Emily. On the other hand, I've observed that our families of Negroes double in about 25 years, which is an increase of the capital invested in them of 4%, over and above keeping up the original number. What's to be noted in here is that this is a man who's tracked these over 25 years. He was the largest enslaved holder in Virginia, over 600 during his lifetime. When he died in 1826, the persons enslaved were not freed. They went to pay for the building of Monticello. Now, until 1998 or 99, the Jefferson estate would deny any of this. And it was only with the development of DNA that they finally had to go, well, oops, oh, well, we missed that particular part. Images like this, you can see what's interesting over here. You see the hands-on, what we would call a Me Too movement over here. This is all London. This is all London. So London was making its way with, and you see that this is so casual that people in the background aren't even paying it any attention. So ordinary. Here's Jefferson again. Worried by an increase in infant mortality among his enslaved Blacks, Jefferson believed, quote, "it was for moral as well as interested considerations." Anyone here who has purchased a house in the last 30 years understands that part of the contract, in the contract, is going to say for blank consideration. Consideration is a term in finance that means money. So whenever you sell a contract, the language of to have and to hold and say forward, this is contract law. And when you see a language, such and such transaction for X consideration, consideration is how much it cost. So the Jefferson here is talking not only about moral, but as well as interested consideration, i.e. money. Overseers should persevere slaves' lives, not for their labor, but their increase. He notes again that he made a significant profit for every year the birth of a child. "I allow nothing for losses by death, but on the contrary, shall presently take credit 4% per annum for their increase over and above keeping up their numbers." In other words, his enslaved were yielding him a perpetual Schumann dividend at compound interest. He was very particular about the books he kept. Well, and while he never made his Thomas Jefferson on a document of freedom or manumission, he does figure into the public record. 15th day of January, 1827, Monticello, County of Albemarle. The residue of the personal estate of Thomas Jefferson, deceased, 130 valuable Negroes, stock, crop, etc., household and kitchen furniture. They just jumble it all together. There's persons and there's stock and there's crop, household and kitchen furniture, and we're going to come back later to the word stock. The attention of the public is earnestly invited to this property. The Negroes are believed to be the most valuable for their number ever offered at one time in the state of Virginia. And of course, they're playing on the name of Jefferson. 1850 to 1827, 6 months following his death. 100 people were sold that day. Charlottesville now. And Charlotte, and you're going to say, who's Charlotte? Well, there's Queen Charlotte. What do we know about Queen Charlotte? Oh, we'll talk a little about Queen Charlotte in a moment. Randolph, the lawyer doing the legal work for Thomas Jefferson, a pre-printed receipt, Jefferson's hand, Sally, his 3/4 European half-sister of his wife. I'm sure I can't figure out the relationships here. Is he master-in-law? Is he father-in-law? One can certainly say that this was not an agency relationship, that she had no choice in this, but she did have 5 children. These are 4 of them. Okay. We wonder where he got the name Madison from, don't we? He was as eager as anyone else to show curry favor. Shannon Lanier, you may have read this, Newsweek. Mr. Lanier is a news commentator in Houston, Texas. I'm a descendant of President Jefferson. Take his public statues down. You can read this yourself. The issue of question, and I alluded to it earlier, and I'll come back to it, is so how do we remake history? Do the statues of Andrew Jackson and Jefferson and the Ellington Memorial and Columbus and George Washington, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Do we eliminate all that? Can we unwhitewash this material? And what does one do with that? I think that there are theoretical questions here that need to be examined. And my first instinct is to say, well, whatever one takes down, one should, I'd say Joni Mitchell, pave it, make a parking lot, have a museum of some kind. That we need to remember what we're trying to forget, or need to remember what we're trying to at least eliminate. And when we come to places like New York and Charlottesville and Savannah, New York itself, what do you do with the name? We'll talk about that. And there's a lot of marble around Jefferson, a lot of it, a lot of street names. Again, this is Richmond. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I want to just show you some of this later. This was originally a notorious Lumpkins jail prison. It later became the Richmond Theological Seminary, and then finally a university, Virginia Union. There's a whole district in Richmond, and we were there just fairly recently. Richmond does better with the kind of the Confederate aspect of marking material, but if we were to go around, and we'll show a slide later, if we were going to go around later and demarcate wherever there was a killing, there would be a very different narrative in foot. Because of course we see when we see these sorts of things. I mean, if somebody once calls these, call these white people memorials, slave auction site, it enables us to feel good that we're no longer there. Well, there's a different narrative, and it's hard as a white historian, again, I come back to that, whose learning is European. I mean, I teach courses in what I would call the European continental tradition. And I tell the universities, we should change the curriculum for starts, because people like Jefferson and Locke and Kant, these are the persons who made the problem for us. But so when we start talking about the material that I'm showing, it's easy for, I'll say, quote, us white people to look at this and say, well, now it's like watching the film Glory and saying, oh, well, we're much better now. Are we? 176-year-old slave auction block removed from Virginia City's downtown. This is Virginia, Armfield, dealers enslaved, Franklin and Armfield, Duke Street. It's now called Freedom House, and I think it's 1315 Duke Street. See it here. Matthew Brady has some wonderful Civil War photographs of this area. I need to read this. Cash for 500 Negroes. This is Armfield and Franklin. Both sexes, 12 to 25 years of age, people having likely servants to dispose of, will find it to their interest to give us a call as we will make higher prices. Many of the enslaved blacks were children. 11. Look at them. Look how small these people are. 4.5, 10, 4.1, 12, 4.7, 10, 3.10, 12, 4.4. What kind of, one asks oneself, what kind of culture is this possible? As many as 1 million people are thought to have passed between 1828 and 1861 through Washington, D.C. on their way to bondage in Mississippi and Louisiana. And they call the Deep South, different from the Upper South or Lower South. The Deep South largely were traders and enslavers from the Caribbean who were bringing their cotton and their sugar into the particular coast. And their methods were much more draconian than the US, which was still in practice. But in 1820, an enslaved child in the Upper South had a 30% chance of being sold by 1860. And that's without a parent. This is an early shot of the inside of the slave pen in Alexandria. Alexandria, early Alexandria, Here's again the question for those who join us from the Philippines. And by the way, there's a couple folks from the Philippines. When we go back to 1893 and or 1898 and the atrocities that the U.S. the colonization of the Philippines, it's again, it takes one's breath away. And then also Hawaii in 1893. When Martin Luther King calls us a colonizing country, it's absolutely the case. And why we don't see that particular narrative in the way that we do, it's a different issue. The District of Columbia, this is the map that we have here now. So my takeaway from this is whenever one sees the map of Washington, D.C. as you see it now, it actually is the shadow of enslavement on it. Because in 1850, when they had the compromise between the North and the South on eliminating enslavement in Washington, D.C., Virginia, then part of the district, said nope, because this is where we make our money at Alexandria in the markets in the selling of enslavement. So this cannot, if this part is going to be removed from the legal selling of the product of enslaved, then we can't have it in the district. So in 1846, they removed themselves back to Virginia. So whenever you see the District of Columbia, remember enslavement. Ending Virginia, carry me back. The nostalgia of the antebellum South. How is it that the song, a minstrel song of an older Black American who has served his plantation for 30, 40 years, all his life, is sold South? How is it that this song becomes, it's a minstrel tune, recognized in Virginia as the state song? Why would I want to be carried back to captivity? How can I sing songs captive in a foreign land? To use that quote that we'll come to a little later. I asked my ethics class, in what kind of culture would the recent incident of Governor Northam in blackface, what kind of culture would that happen? Be permitted without comment. North of the Mason-Dixon, here's the New England. Make me rich, but don't show me how. I want to note here, and you see, again, slavery's growth. 1783, every state had slaves. 1800, almost every northern state had abolished. 1846, no slavery in the South, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You want to notice the rhetoric exculpating the North, because what I would call the museum memory of the culture is that enslavement happened down here, but not up there. But as a matter of fact, what happened up here made this possible. And whether it was officially encouraged, as in New York and New Jersey, or not, as in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the slave trade flourished in colonial northern ports. Look up liquor enslavement in Rhode Island, and you realize that Newport, Rhode Island had 60% of the enslaved shippage out of the United States, north or south, to the Caribbean. This is the text on Baltimore. Although the United States banned the transatlantic slave trade, and there's that language again. It obfuscates, it doesn't tell you who did what. It's just simply, it's a big body of water, but it removes the names of the persons. And if it's appropriate to say their names, it's appropriate to say the names of Portugal and Spain and Denmark and Britain and Belgium. And when you think about the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, where Belgium and the Congo and the simple atrocities that were happening there, we can focus on Nazi Germany, we can focus on lots of different things. We have issues much closer to home that can be paid attention to. A domestic trade from the Upper South to the emerging cotton growing regions, actually rice growing regions of the Deep South, thrived until the 1860s and beyond, because then under Jim Crow, you had convict leasing. The persons who were no longer enslaved were nonetheless sent back as sharecroppers and as convicts and leased out. Baltimore-based dealers supplied the trade, operating slave pens at the Inner Harbor on Fells Point and across the city. And to this day, you can go through these areas and see very little evidence of this. Now, perhaps a little bit more, but there's a certain race to put up these kinds of signs and dedications. And, you know, I mean, Black Americans are right to say it's a little late now, and you know what? Who does the sign please or take care of? It's not taking care of the Black people. It says nothing at all about them, what happened to them. You'll notice we don't know where they're buried. You don't know anything about them except when they appear in a trade book as bought and sold. Early 1838. Cash for Negroes, opening of a private jail at Pratt and Howard. And I use this because we know the names of the streets. We passed them, not surpassed by any establishment. And understand how late this is. The 1838, also what happens is very similar to what happened in 2008. We had a collapse of the stock market. And at this point, the stock were actually human bodies. And so the mortgages and the investments into Black bodies, and I use it that particular way because that's exactly what it was, almost collapsed in the economy then. Slatter offered to house and feed slaves there for 25 cents a day. I hold myself bound to make good all jailbreaking or escapes my establishment. And DC had a hotel, did the same thing. They had basically a slave prison beneath the restaurant. Sure. Children, bought and sold. In this place, I found 26 men, 1 boy, 29 women, and 3 infants. 16 of the men were shackled, and 1 had his legs chained together by ingeniously contrived locks, connected by chains suspended to his waist. A coffle is a line of enslaved persons bound by the necks by chains, bound by the feet as chained. Northern public opinion, quote, accepted slavery, approved of doing business with those who controlled it, abhorred its Black victims, and loathed Northern whites who agitated against it. This is a fairly recent, 1980 actually, we'll see one earlier. This is 1942. The effects of the New England collusion with enslavement was momentous. The selling of slaves, transporting them was one of the foundations of New England's economic structure. It created a wealthy class of slave trading merchants, while the profits derived from this commerce stimulated cultural development and philanthropy. And kind of as your homework, when you finish this, you're going to go out and you're going to take your favorite bank, or you're going to take out your favorite charity, and you're going to Google your favorite charity / enslavement and hold your breath, because no one escapes this. Museum memory, what I call public memory. Slavery in the United States was peculiar to the South. And unless explicitly reminded of the North's history of enslavement, most Americans associate the North with abolitionists rather than slaveholders. All you got to do is drive up and down through Massachusetts and Connecticut, and you understand, and Rhode Island, that the agricultural use of enslavement as practiced in Virginia and Maryland doesn't happen up here. So as a matter of fact, for the same reason that Britain outlawed enslavement in 1807, the abolitionist cause here was because it was no longer economic. This is not humanitarian motions, this is economics. Northern manufacturers, banks, lenders, mills, distilleries, and you can Google any of this, reaped the profits of the Southern plantations, and the federal government collected the tariff. Any further effort made in the North toward resolving enslavement generally went into the pipe dream of colonization. And that again is this notion, even Lincoln, he was going to send the free Africans, quote, home. And they pointed out to him in a meeting in the White House, we live here, this is our home, we're not African. He kind of paused. And the North wanted to make sure that Southern Blacks stayed there, or at least did not come north. And again, you can just Google enslavement, Jim Crow, Connecticut, Massachusetts, to this day, even in New Hampshire. The Rex Theater, that's Connecticut. Whites only within city limits after dark, Connecticut. By the way, some people suggest that this was actually an early sign for Jewish who were not yet considered white. 1/5 of the white families in New York City owned slaves, and yet fewer than 80 slaveholders in the city voluntarily freed them from 1783 to 1800. By 1830, still 3,500 people enslaved in the North and in New Jersey until after the war between the states. I'm going to spend a little time here. My background is in New English history, and I'm going to go back here to something we never learned in school. Massachusetts Bay Colony was the first slave-holding colony in New England. Massachusetts Bay Colony, home of the Puritans, the first state to have official legal enslavement law. The first enslaved African indigene were brought to the colony in the 17th century after a whole history of enslaving the Pequot, the Massachusetts, the Nausets, and the other nations of Indians. 1641, Governor John Winthrop. Do we remember John Winthrop? Sure we do. He came in on the Mayflower, the whole Christian compact. We know this, we grew up with it, we learned it in school. He's the one who gave us the expression, for we shall be a city on the hill. We know this man, Reagan knew this man. He's a slave owner himself. He helped write the first legal law, North America, the Massachusetts Body of Liberty. The General Court passed on December 10, 1641. Winthrop, Christian charity, a model thereof. This is the text that he wrote as they were parked in the shore outside Provincetown before they actually landed, and about setting up the compact of this new Christian country. This is the tiresome image that they trot out for Thanksgiving every year. Little did the Native Americans or the indigenes know that this was going to be their downfall. The first persons to be enslaved by whites in New England were Native American prisoners of war, given as favors to other tribes who had allied themselves with the settlers' cause. To be clear, scalping was not Native American, it was settler. Someone who brought a scalp in was given a bounty. Did the indigene return the favor? Sure they did, but the original scalping was simply a way you couldn't carry it. This was a way of proving how much money you were to be given for a stipend for the work that you had done of removing these persons from their land. Jeffrey Amherst, for example, who gives us Amherst College, just Google Jeffrey Amherst comments and activities around the indigene in Massachusetts and Connecticut. So a note to John Winthrop, the then governor. There's a little squaw that Stewart Cocklet desireth. Lieutenant Danforth also desireth one, to wit, a tall one with 3 strokes upon her stomach. These were persons who were used by white settlers. And colonists living in New England relied on the labor of thousands of indigenous Indians and Americans. And the practice dates back to their earliest colonies. The Pequot, enslaved in 1637 after clashing with the English. Again, Herman Melville and Ahab and all of the work on the Pequot, we know the kind of the language. What we don't know about Melville, that Melville's texts are critically anti-racist and anti-enslavement. And so the whole issue of Moby Dick centers on this impossible situation that the American colonies and states find themselves in. This is a New York Times review. In America's long history of enslavement, New England shares the blame. Slave ownership reached down the social scale. African captives helped replace the Native American communities displaced by English colonists. African captives were in some ways more useful to the New England because the native indigene, they said, could simply, if they got tired of what they were doing, they could escape. The native Africans could not do that. As enslaved African came in, New England merchants sent Indian captives out to the Barbados and somewhere else beyond the seas. We'll see this here. Vast majority of the slaves were carried to the sugar colonies of the Caribbean and South America. So there's a triangle. We talk about the Bermuda, we talk about the triangle, the international trade triangle. There's a triangle from Newport to the Caribbean to Europe. Liquor, cotton, sugar, and the manufacturing in New England. So Rhode Islanders entered the trade in about 1700. By the middle of the 18th century, upwards of 20 ships per year sailed for Africa from the tiny colony. Over the next century, more than 60% of North American ships in the African slave trade were based in Rhode Island. Sidebar, you remember Tituba, central to the story of Salem's 1793 witch purging? Well, something we're not taught about the Puritans. Tituba probably was Barbados. Okay, her husband went on to become one of the accusers in the witch trials. Okay. She was the enslaved person of Samuel Parris, the Reverend. She was in his household. Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne were sent to jail for witchery in 1892. They were pressed to death, buried under rocks. There's no proof that she did the things to which she has confessed. Reverend Samuel Parris, a good Puritan, brought Tituba in Barbados, where she had been enslaved since her capture during childhood. Wonders of the Invisible World, Cotton Mather. Now, you can read and read and read, and I did a PhD on all this, and you can read and read and read, and never once find any of this referenced. The indigeneity themselves are erased. The enslavement of any of this is erased. Here's the triangle I was telling you about. Newport, Africa, Barbados. Slaves, rum, sugar, tobacco, rice, indigo, gold, sugar, and molasses. And what you're not even talking about here is the invisible triangle, the triangle of the investments and the insurance and the mortgages. Faneuil Hall. Do we know that this man, Peter Faneuil, was one of the earliest and most substantial slave traders? And it was fairly typical that philanthropists, Rockefeller, and you could name the name, that the money, ill-gotten gain came in through, and a way of salving consciousness was to put it into philanthropy. So by the 1660s and 1670s, for example, in Boston's harbor, one historian estimates that over half the ships are going directly to or from the West Indies. There's a strong connection, the Puritan colonies, to this enterprise going on down in the South. Faneuil was a merchant who made money off slavery, owned slaves themselves, bought and sold in the auction block right next to Faneuil Hall. If you've been following the recent, there was a monument there, and there's some talk that this was, it's kind of a white people's memorial, and I have a circumspect opinion on it that I'm trying to rethink how we memorialize and what we memorialize. And public memory is important, and who claims it and who owns it. And if we look at what's being publicly memorialized and what is being publicly forgotten, how the North promoted, prolonged, profited. Lorenzo Green again, slavery, quote, formed the basis of the economic life of New England. On it revolved and on it depended most of her other enterprises. All right, this is Lowell, the textile mills from 1834, 1858. Number of textile mills over doubled. Slave population, probably 45% increase. Pounds of cotton, quadrupled. Okay. Now, there's not a one-to-one ratio, but one can see here that as the enslaved population increases, you're having at the same time the manufacturing in the North that's increasing all this. And they will still talk about the reason the North won the Civil War in the South, because the North was not agricultural, the North was machined and manufacturing. And part of what you're seeing over here is that all of the material that was produced in the South was complicit with what was going on in the North. Fugitive Slave Law 1850, which essentially turned any one of us into a deputy slave catcher. So this was a sign this was an advertisement in Boston. Colored people of Boston hereby respectfully cautioned and advertised to watchmen and police officers of Boston, kidnappers and slave traders. So the rhetoric of enslavement in the North is high and constant. This may surprise a few folks. The Duke of York in 1664. New York had been a slave trading city almost since its inception as a Dutch settlement in 1624. The West India Company in 1626 delivered 13 Brazilian natives, indigene, to the tiny New Amsterdam. By 1800, 1 in every 5 families owned slaves. In the 1850s, the New York City merchants depended on the foreign slave trade more than ever. Investors in New York financed New York-based ships that picked up captives in West Africa. They sold in Cuba and Brazil. I have this line in blue. In 1850, 25% of the population of New Orleans and Louisiana, New Orleans, Louisiana, were Northerners. 10% of the people in Mobile, Alabama, former New Yorkers. Auctions of cheap former Indian lands in Mississippi drew bidders from the South and the East. The largest purchaser of Chickasaw land in Mississippi, the American Land Company and the New York Land Company. The two companies represented investors or speculators from New York, Boston, and other New Englanders. The guinea. You know, we read Dickens, we know what a guinea is. A guinea is a British coin. Do we know it as King Charles, King James, the guinea from Ghana? The guinea was so called because, as a matter of fact, it was made out of gold that derived from Ghana. James II, the Duke of York, who later became King James of England, later James VII of Scotland, creates Britain's greatest slave empire known as the Royal African Company, which transported between 90,000 and 100,000 African slaves to the Caribbean and American colonies between 1672 and 1689. And again, the question that I come back to, this is Wall Street, 1730. The question I come back to was, in some ways, we hear about Black Lives Matters and enslavement and reparations. We hear about these in the United States. One seems as if Britain is being given a pass. In some ways, for your regular average citizen of Britain, enslavement is a very non-issue because, as a matter of fact, it happened in the Dominions. It happened in India. It happened in Africa. It happened in the Caribbean. The United States, we live in the history that we have created. And we can say that we ourselves perhaps did not create this history, but we profit from it, from its structures and its systems. Royal African Company by the man who gave us New York. Seal shows an elephant bearing a castle, flanked by 2 bound enslaved men. Surrounding the figures, you can't see it here in the Latin, is the company's motto, by royal patronage, commerce flourishes. New York, what do we do with the name, York? 90,000. So enslavement was not a Southern problem. North and South each profited. In New York particularly, the issue was public and contemporary. Stock. How many of us have stock? Do we check the stock every day? Reminds us where the word came from, livestock. Also a site of public degradation. As early as 1809, places where securities are bought and sold market. The original stock market in London, mid-14th century, fish and meat market in the city of London. Stock market, 1711. This is a quote from a still standing New York law. Law appointing a place for the more convenient hiring of slaves, 1711. Be it ordained by the mayor recorder that all Negro and Indian slaves that are let out to hire within this city do take up their standing in order to be hired at the market house at the Wall Street slip until such time as they are hired. It's not unlike when you drive into Home Depot and you see men and women standing there looking for work. Here, they're captive. Whereby all persons may know where to hire as slaves, as their occasions shall require, and also masters discover when their slaves are so hired, and all the inhabitants of the city are to take notice hereof accordingly. What the background of this is that, as a matter of fact, in the North, enslaved persons were rarely used by their owners, but they were rented out as day help, as was Frederick Douglass in Baltimore, to somebody else, and the owner of the enslaved took the profit. Pearl and Wall Street. New York City was second only to Charleston, South Carolina for the busiest slave market. More than 20% of its population was slaves. When Trinity Church banned burial for poor people, quote, unquote, in 1697, the African American cemetery began, and some may know the history of this, that in 1993, in building for a federal building in Washington, in New York, they discovered what looked to be a burial ground, unmarked burial site. New York City buried thousands of Black people here and forgot about it until it was rediscovered. This is what I was talking about, the burial ground in Washington, D.C. at the edge of the Woodrow Wilson Bridge. Unearthed during construction of an office building in Broadway in 1993, I think. The cemetery became a New York landmark in 1993 and a national monument in 2007. Estimated 20,000 African enslaved were buried here until the 1790s. And again, they're not buried, they're not marked, they're not named, they're not anything, they're dumped. So 419 broiler remains were reburied in wooden coffins in 7 mounds at the memorial site. You may remember this guy here. If you're familiar, you know the bridge. So my point earlier about if you wanted to track genealogies of Black Americans, you wouldn't go to usually a churchyard, you would go to the financial records. Woman, child, 9 to 16 months. Woman, 18 to 20, child, 2 to 4. Woman, 25 to 36, man, 35 to 45. Say the names. The Cotton Club, there you go. The South exports most of its cotton through New York City. Many of its imports came through it. Bankers, factors, what we would call a factory now, merchants were the source of much of the financings of the South's lords of the lash, is what the enslavers were called. Some New Yorkers continued to finance the slave trade after it became illegal in 1808. And there was narratives of ships that were brought into New York illegally with enslaved. The name Cotton Club. In 1848, Charles Sumner denounces the alliance between, quote, the cotton planters and fleshmongers of Louisiana and Mississippi and the cotton spinners and traffickers of New England, between the lords of the lash and the lords of the loom. The 1619 project, which I recommend, it's very interesting, it's very useful history, it's completely good. I want to make one particular point. Enslavement in the United States and Virginia did not start in 1619. That's its whole point, that 20 Africans were brought captive into Virginia in 1619. The indigeny in Virginia, the captives, Pocahontas, for example, was 1607. Columbus started the indigenous transport of enslaved Indians in 1495. So there's a 125-year history of enslavement that 1619 does not address. Why is this important? Because it's not simply about one specific race of persons. It's about the indigeny, it's about the Black Americans, It's about the numerous persons who were born and raised in this country, which should be their home, which they should have legal rights. And if we're going to understand, again, back to Martin Luther King's, the settler colonial history of the United States, we need also to understand of the numbers of persons involved. We're coming to the end here, and I'm sure I'm looking at my watch over here. We are very quickly, just to repeat what I've already said, America's first bond market was backed by enslaved human beings. This was not simply a very personal issue between one person laying out a $20 bill for a servant, but international and national markets fueled plantation boom. Bureau 1860 Census of Manufacturers, the manufacture of cotton constitutes the most striking feature of the industrial history of the last 50 years. When the United States ended its legal participation in the global slave trade in 1808, slave traders nonetheless moved 1 million slaves from the tobacco-producing Upper South to the cotton fields in the Lower. $12 million annual profit. This harrowing trade in human flesh supported middle-class occupations North, South, bankers and doctors and lawyers, insurance brokers, shipping agents, and profited. And you saw Jefferson, he had lawyers that were profiting just basically the sale. Very quickly, chattel mortgages, just so you see that I'm not making things up. New York. Colonial times when land was not worth much and banks didn't exist, most lending was based on human property. Seeking loans, planters used enslaved people as collateral. Jefferson could not free his enslaved on his death because 150 of them were held by mortgage. Of course, you insure your property. Extra premiums, coal pits, steamboats, canal, mining, coasting. Number of slave mortgages in South Carolina, 1776, 1843. Again, very particular about the numbers. We don't know their names, but we know their value. That's why I think it's a little tone deaf that we'd want to put this woman on a $20 bill. Does Harriet Tubman deserve memorialization? Yes. Name the Woodrow Wilson Bridge after her, perhaps, since as a matter of fact, what she did was help people get from the South to the North. But don't put her on a dollar bill because it was the moneyed paper document by which all these folks lost their lives and their value. Very quickly, doing the laundry, philanthropy and education. Survivors carry history on themselves, in which we do. The founding fathers in red: Charles Carroll, Chase, Franklin, Winnet, Hancock, Henry, Jay, Jefferson, Lee, Madison. You guessed it, owned slaves. Adams, Ellsworth, Hamilton, Payne, Sherman did not. Benjamin Franklin owned enslaved. Actually, he wasn't very good with the Germans either. Google sometime Franklin's comments about Germans. Monticello, and on the left you find what some historians think is actually the handprint of an enslaved person in a brick off the Jefferson building. Washington. Universities: Brown, Columbia, Georgetown, Hamilton, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Pennsylvania, Princeton, Yale. Built with used enslaved money, supported, invested. Johns Hopkins and Georgetown have particularly done work on rehabilitation. Georgetown University, my university. 1838, Jesuit priests, founders of Georgetown, sold 272 slaves, used the money worth $3 million to pay off debts. To offset some of the damage, in 2016, the university provides preferential administration to the descendants of the slaves who had been sold. They do more than that. And I as a model of reparations, as a protocol, what Georgetown is doing is worth investigating. And if persons have questions about reparations and who should do it and how they should do it, This was the Emancipation at NDC, again, which is a very different thing, and Lincoln had nothing to do with this. And this was 8 months before. The DC Emancipation was important because it's the only Emancipation Act of any kind in the United States by which some compensation was given to the slaveholders, but never to the enslaved. Again, one of the few enslaved whose names we know. This is on the bill of sale. Know all men by these presidents that I, Thomas F. Malletti of Georgetown. He would have been called one of the Roman Catholic gentlemen of Maryland because, as a matter of fact, they weren't allowed to call themselves priests. He was Father Malletti of Georgetown, District of Columbia. Have bargained and sold, and by these presidents do bargain, sell, and deliver unto Henry Johnson of the parish of St. James, Louisiana, the following Negroes. And there's that name again, Columbia. Harvard, North Carolina. We end here, 1857. Gang of 460 Negroes, accustomed to the culture of rice and provisions, a number of good mechanics and house servants. 1857, terms of sale, 1/3 cash. Reminder by bond, bearing interest from date of sale payable in equal annual installments, to be secured by mortgage on the Negro approved personal security. It's astonishing when one thinks about this. As a matter of fact, we're not used to thinking about the apparatus of the finance behind and around enslavement. But suddenly you see here, any one of us here knows how difficult it is to get a mortgage or even to go to the bank and do this kind of work. And suddenly you see a legal apparatus around insurance and finances and banks. These folks, they meant what they were doing. It's time to rename all the schools named after slave owners. Well, this is an article from a newspaper, and I put it up here as a kind of a, what do you think? Time to rename all the schools named after slave owners? Robert E. Lee and Jefferson and Montgomery and George Washington University, and oh, suddenly, these are names of US federal courts, counties, countries, districts, with names of persons who held slaves. What does one do with all that? Oh, Columbus, mass killer and the father of the slave trade. There's no column about that. Uncomfortable truth. Time to recognize that Christopher Columbus was responsible for over 3 million deaths. It's not my quote, but I can give you the references for it, and you can look at it, and you can, as a matter of fact, see in his own handwriting that he wanted 10% of all the enslavement that he started from the Caribbean to the Spanish Queen. New York was named after a slaver who shipped 90,000 Africans to America. Has 24 plus streets named for slave owners. This, by the way, was yesterday. So if you go to New York and the legislature is debating renaming these streets. Well, what about New York itself? What about this guy? York, what do we do with that? Not so much worried about her, but do we know this woman here? Charlotte, oh. Charlotte, wasn't she the German consort of King George, who, by the way, couldn't speak English, who was actually a Habsburgian German, who married her sight unseen? And it turns out that she was likely Black. 1873, who knows? How slavery built Charleston, King Charles. Columbus, George Washington, Woodrow Wilson Bridge, Jamestown, Charlotte, Charleston, Duke of York. What do you do with all of these? Okay, next time around. This has been the story of how a social structure in the United States is one that passes largely without seeing, although it's everywhere in sight. What I'm going to do in my next session is to look at this from the point of view of a Black American's perspective, and what we use the language of, not restitution, but revolts and slave atrocities, and how all these, how people escape from slavery. So I'm going to try and look at that, and I'm going to bring it all the way up through to 2021 and George Floyd. Back to you, Robert.
Okay, sorry. Okay, thanks, Ed. That was awesome. We have a lot of questions, as you can imagine. If you do have a question for Ed, please let us know. You can type it in the chat or the Q&A in Zoom, or you can type it in the comment section if you're watching on Facebook Live. And thanks to all of those that are joining us today, either on Zoom or Facebook. So Ed, we do have quite a few questions for you. So let me go ahead and dive into those. The first question, people always ask this in every presentation you do. And for those that weren't on some of the previous ones, we'll let you answer it again. How did you get interested in this topic? Because you have such an in-depth knowledge of it. How did your what were the origins of your interest and involvement in this topic?
I'm a gay man in the Catholic Church. Start. I had a woman vest me in ordination. Fact. I taught Georgetown's first gay narrative course in 1994, and I said, it's a little late in the 20th century for that. I started doing work in animal justice, non-human animal justice, and I came across, I just kept thinking about the way that the collar and the chains went back and forth, and the language of domestication went back and forth. And I could only say that humbly, that people are teaching me to think better.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you. Just as a reminder, so this program is being recorded. If you joined us late or want to watch it again, or if you know anyone else who'd be interested, it's going to be recorded. It'll be put on our YouTube page. The previous sessions that Ed did are also on our YouTube page, and I pasted that in the chat in Zoom and also in the comments in Facebook. I'll also email it out afterwards in case you want to join us for that. So a question from Cynthia. She just talking about, she has not heard much about how enslaved people were actually captured in Africa, and she's hoping that one of your future programs will be discussing that. Just thought I'd pass that along with you as well. A question from Patricia. She says that as regards to mortgaging of the enslaved people, what happened in the event the mortgage person's death or escape?
They lost their credit, and that's why they were insured. For the same thing that if your house burns down on your mortgage, the mortgagee has insurance on it.
Okay. Let's see. And then here's a question from AA. Says, when I did research on the setup of Southern town squares and what they were used for, it seemed like I found out the planning and design was associated sometimes with slave auctions. Is that your opinion as well?
Yes.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
Period.
I would have. Let's see. And then
let me go back to that. Because as I said, the public performance of whiteness is an important public moment of this particular culture. So it really does no good to, and I said this in my ethics class, when Frederick Douglass starts talking about the 4th of July, he says, what is the 4th of July to an enslaved person? But the various rituals by which white America celebrates itself, and there are hundreds of them, I'm not going to get into it here. So I'm inviting us to think about these kinds of rituals and our involvement in them.
Okay. And then Jennifer wanted to chime in. You were talking before about how a lot of enslaved people were actually rented out. And you mentioned Frederick Douglass. Also, Harriet Tubman, as a 6-year-old child, was rented out to other people. So just a very prevalent part of the process, unfortunately.
Most of Washington, D.C. was built by rented enslaved.
Okay. Let's see. Here's a question from Patricia. Wasn't Eli Whitney, the cotton gin guy, a Northerner?
Yes, he was. He came down. Actually, he came down for a very different kind of reason. In 1793, he came down to do a different kind of job, and it was his kind of invention of the cotton gin that suddenly made a 1 pound a day product from an enslaved person of cotton who could then pick 50. But she's right, he's Northern.
Okay, no problem. And then let's see, another question from Jennifer. She mentioned, she brought up the fact that you talked about Monticello and your concerns about that. Are there any sites in particular, like museums or whatnot, that you feel do a good job of kind of telling this story or interpreting this history that you recommend?
There's, there's the Native Africa, the African Memorial Museum. The problem with museums is that they're public memory. And so in order to get beyond the public memory, but most museums are now going over themselves to look back at their catalogs and to look back. For example, you can go to the Portrait Museum, and the Portrait Museum has a portrait of Johns Hawkins, one of the earliest British slavers from Elizabeth I. It never once mentions the enslavement. So they have to go back and are redoing much of this.
Oh, I see. Okay, let's see.
So the African Memorial Museum in Washington, it's a public performance still, and it's still cultural memory. And the problem with the cultural narrative is it's going to have an edge to it.
Okay. Let's see. Kim mentioned, I'm ashamed to say we still have an auction block in my hometown square. It's 2021, for goodness sake. Kim, you should let us know where that is. Where is that auction? Because there are still a few of them around the United States. So that's interesting. Terry wanted to mention, just want to make sure you saw this, Ed. Ed, I've been doing genealogy for a long time. This is the first presentation that has explained the migration in a way that most can understand. Your pictures and historical references are superb. Thank you so much. So if you have any, thank you very much for that. If you have any other questions or comments for Ed, please let us know.
Robert, can I come back to the moment?
Yeah, sure. Oh yeah, definitely. Sure, of course.
For example, when I said walking down the street in Washington, D.C., the CVS, the market in Washington, D.C., on Georgetown's was a major enslavement block. The CVS, the back wall of it, still has the bricks, the rock. They weren't bricks at the time; they were rocks that built the slave pen. You can actually see the brick where the brick built onto the original building. So it's that kind of markage that you can still find, but you're not going to find that in a museum.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's see. Here's a question from Barry. Is there any likelihood that city names will be changed?
Well, if you pick up the New York Times yesterday, there were 16 towns in New York, in Texas, and New York is going. It's like trying to talk about Huckleberry Finn and trying to use certain kinds of language. The New York Times doesn't even know how to talk about the town's names because, quote, they have, quote, Negro in them. So the New York Times is trying to know what to do with this, but there are 16 towns in Texas that, as we speak, are trying to sort out what they're going to do with their names.
Okay.
And I'm not serious when you talk about New York and Charleston. And at what point do we take down the statues of the author Dred Scott, the Roger Taney Supreme Court Justice? And it's easy to pull a statue down, but I don't want to destroy the statues. Clearly, I mean, so what do you do with it? How do we contest a public narrative that needs contesting? Mm-hmm. I don't mean to eliminate it, just to contest it.
Okay. And then here's a question from Suzanne. This was from pretty early in the presentation. She asked, reparations has been in the news a lot lately. Not sure if you want to answer this question, but if you had to guess, do you think reparations will ever be paid in the United States? Yes or no?
Yes, it already has been. Ronald Reagan in 1988 signed reparations bill for Japanese for $20,000 for descendants. We've done it for the indigenes somewhat. Illinois just did it for in terms of its housing market. But the simple answer is yes.
Okay, so we think we're moving in that direction. Okay, let's see if there's any other questions. Let's see. So yeah, a couple people asked again, will the recording be available? Yes, it'll be on our YouTube page, so I'll post that. You can also just find us on YouTube. Washington, D.C. History and Culture is the name of our channel. It has Ed's previous programs as well, and of course, be the future ones there at some point in time. And let's see, I think that might be the end of the questions. So, okay, yeah, I think that does wrap it up. Ed, thanks again so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to share all this information, knowledge with us, a very difficult topic to listen to sometimes, but a very important one for us to understand more about our history and kind of the certain situation we're in. Any closing thoughts or comments for us, Ed?
Thank you. To quote Gandhi, the good work we do might seem insignificant, but it's important that we do it. Take this work, what works for you, leave the rest, and pass it on, pass it forward.
Oh, excellent. Well, thank you. Thanks, everyone. And hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Stay safe. And again, at some point in time, we'll be meeting in person as we get closer to COVID getting more under control. So thanks, everyone. Hope to see you at either sometime in the near future, either online again for our next live stream program, or perhaps in person someday. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, especially thanks to Ed. Take care. Have a great weekend.